honor inviting me to this wonderful conference. And it's appropriate that this conference is being held in Netherlands, which had a golden age of uncertainty in the 17th century that created unbelievable wealth through the Dutch East India Company and went on to produce the greatest artists that have lived on this earth: Rembrandt, Vermeer, Frans Hals, all that my wife and I saw yesterday in the Rijksmuseum. Meanwhile, another country in Europe was afraid of uncertainty. And what did it produce? The cuckoo clock. Today, France's 35-hour week is the outcome of trying to reduce uncertainty in human life. But it is sending wrong signals to the young about the value of work and risk-taking. Picasso did not work a 35-hour week. The subject of this conference is indeed bizarre, when the most cherished desire of human beings has always been to create certainty, predictability in this uncertain, insecure world. The human condition is vulnerable. One does not know why one is born, when one will die, and what are the reverses one will face on the way. The only thing certain is that one will die one day. Hence the search for certainty, for predictability. The Greeks sought to conquer it through human reason. Ancient Indians depended on the notion of dharma to protect one in this uncertain world. In the 2,000-year-old epic Mahabharata, a game of dice is at the center of the narrative, of the plot. And at the moment of his greatest triumph, the hero of this epic, when he is consecrated King of Kings, he loses his kingdom, he loses his armies, himself, and his wife in a rigged game of dice. And that dice game is symbolic of the vulnerable human condition. So the epic goes on to tell us that the state was created in order No, before I talk about that, let me come back to the epic in a minute. You know, many countries have a code word which unlocks the secret of the country like a key. America's code word is liberty, and Americans do very many odd things in the name of liberty, such as creating the Tea Party movement or having a gun lobby. France's code word is égalité, and they too do odd things like the 35-hour week in the name of equality. India's code word is dharma, the word I mentioned a few minutes ago, which means many things, but essentially think of it as doing the right thing. So in India, whenever a new corruption scandal breaks out in our democracy, people say that dharma has been wounded. I wonder what the code word is for Holland. Sobriety? You can tell me that. So coming back to the epic says that because of the vulnerable human condition, human beings created the state in order to bring predictability. And the state that we created in India has always been a weak state, unlike China, which is always had a strong state. In India, we've had a strong society, and China's had a weak society. But you need both. You need a strong state to get things done. You need a strong society to make that state accountable. And so India's history has always been a history, like Europe, of competing kingdoms, fighting with each other. Whereas China's history was a history of empires. And we had 4 empires in India, but they were all weaker than the average Chinese empire. In China, the emperor gave the law and then interpreted the law. In India, the law preceded the king, where the duty of the king was to uphold the dharma, the law, for the benefit of the people. And the interpreter of the law was not the king. It was the Brahmin. And so very early on, we had created a liberal division of powers in 6th century BC, in the First Kingdom, which weakened the state. So in India, oppression never came from the state as it did in China. It came from society, from the Brahmins. And the answer to that oppression was the Buddha, or a guru, which came around every few years in the country. Another difference, which will help to illuminate my thesis, is that Indians are accumulators while Chinese are assimilators. By that I mean the people who populated India and China were some of the same tribes who came down from Central Asia. In China, they got absorbed into one Han identity. In India, we accumulated them into 2,200 subcastes. So we became a very plural, diverse society. And so in 1947, when India became independent, it could only be a democracy in a diverse, plural society, and China could only be an autocracy. And today, not surprisingly, India is rising from below, and China has risen from the top. By the top, I mean an amazing technocratic elite in China has created infrastructure, which has brought enormous prosperity, and India is rising almost despite the state. And therefore, India today is really a people's success. It has already created about 25 globally competitive companies, and some of these will become global brand names like Samsung, Heineken, and so on. And so we often say, because India is rising despite the state, that India grows at night when the government sleeps. The problem in India related to uncertainty is that it still needs to become a full-fledged liberal democracy. Now, you've heard India is the largest, it's the most vibrant democracy in the world, with free elections, with a huge amount of free choice, a fiercely independent judiciary, an aggressive press, and with 185 news, 24/7 news channels, of course, in all the languages. But these institutions are weak. And that's why Indians worry. Why should it take 15 years to get justice in the courts? Why should there be corruption? Why should it take 10 years to build a road? And it goes back to what is a modern liberal democracy, which has such a democracy has 3 pillars. One, it has an executive which is capable of taking quick, determined, decisive action when needed. Second, that action is bounded by the rule of law. And third, that action is accountable to the people. The trouble with these 3 pillars is that, unlike the pillars of this church, they do not reinforce each other. Sometimes they undermine each other. And too much push for accountability reduces the power of the state to act, as it has, for example, in the United States with Mr. Obama, where the US government is paralyzed. And so was our government paralyzed until recently. And so that's why what we in India say, because the state lets us down, It doesn't create the kind of certainty that we want, that it grows at night. But of course, we must grow during the day. And that's really the challenge for the new government. And that's why we need to reform our institutions, the bureaucracy, the judiciary, the police, and so on, the institutions of governance that will reduce corruption in society. So this reform will bring the kind of certainty that we need. A modern liberal state creates a balance between certainty and uncertainty. By doing predictable regulation, it creates conditions for entrepreneurs to flourish who will pursue the uncertainty of the market. A state creates uncertainty, but this same state can lead to oppression. And so it's a balance that you must balance the ability of the state to act by the rule of law and accountability. But why? Why does a country like India, with a huge amount of freedom, political, religious, social, why does it have so much difficulty giving economic freedom to its people? Now, this goes back to our socialist period before 1991, when the state tried to really tell people that it will deliver everything. And that, unlike socialist states, it failed. And the trouble, of course, is that in India, we need to still do a lot of reforms, market-based reforms, because the government still controls too much economic activity. But no one has gone out to sell the market to the people. And no one has gone to tell people that there's a difference between being pro-market and pro-business. That pro-market means you stand for competition, competition lowers costs, competition improves the quality of products, and competition finally leads to a rules-based capitalism if you have the right kind of regulation. Whereas pro-business is where the state keeps control of power, of licenses, etc. People have got the impression that, frankly, the market is all about the rich getting richer and the poor getting poorer. It needed in England a Margaret Thatcher to sell the market. Now, we haven't had somebody like that, but that's what it needs to create the right balance between state and the market. And this is difficult. This is difficult because the invisible hand of Adam Smith is invisible. At election time, if one candidate offers free electricity, cheap food, cheap energy, versus a liberal candidate who says, well, we must get investment, which will create jobs, which we must invest in our schools, it will take time, but you'll have a better result. Well, by then, 5 years are up, and you have the next election. So in democracies, it is difficult. It's difficult to sell the liberal democratic state, but it has to be done. It has to be done. So a modern liberal state must create a balance between state and the market, and between the certainty of the state and the uncertainty of the market. In conclusion, let me just come back to the notion of dharma and the epic with which I started, and the game of dice. Now, the same king who played the game of dice was a good man. He was a good ruler. And at the end of the epic, he is going up to heaven. Along the way, a dog attaches itself to him, and they start walking to heaven together. And at the gate of heaven, the heaven keeper, the god Indra, comes out, and he says, "Welcome, great king. We have waited for this moment." And the king, instead of going into heaven, asks, "But what about this dog?" And the heaven keeper gets very upset. He says, But he's not even your dog. He's just a dirty street dog. What are you so worried about him? And besides, he says, this is heaven. No dogs allowed. And so the king does not go into heaven. Now, I don't think anybody in this room would have done what the good king did. But every child in every culture will understand the meaning of dharma from this story. And what the epic is saying is that we live in an uncertain world. It's a dark world. But the ultimate security in this world is what he calls dharma, a certain notion of character. That whether it's the state or the market, whether it's politicians or businessmen, ultimately it is character that is our best protection against the uncertainty of the world. Thank you.